This is one of the most dangerous prisons in the world. They call it a mega prison. It's located in El Salvador. They hold 40,000 people there under incredibly strict conditions, and even the US now sends migrants there. But this prison was built for completely different purposes. Just recently, El Salvador was the most dangerous country in the world. The most murders were committed here, but today it's a modern state and popular resort. Here they pay with Bitcoin, they hold the Miss Universe contest, and El Salvador is also the safest country in the Western Hemisphere. There are fewer murders here than in Canada. And the reason for such changes is this man, Nayib Bukele, the youngest and most popular president in all of Latin America, a social media star. He calls himself the world's coolest dictator. His rating is higher than the Pope's, and his friends are Elon Musk and Donald Trump. Now, politicians from neighboring countries come to learn from him. Bukele is called a model for future presidents, and El Salvador is an example for other states. But this story doesn't usually tell the second part, what all these changes actually cost, what the world's coolest dictator is hiding, exactly how El Salvador went from the most dangerous to safest country, and what this can teach the whole world. 2012. In the small town of Nuevo Cascatalan in El Salvador, mayoral elections are taking place. This isn't even really a city. It's more like the outskirts of the capital, their local equivalent of suburbia. But it's exactly there that big changes for the entire country will begin. A young businessman is running for election. He's 31 years old and doesn't look like other politicians at all. His name is Nayib, a descendant of Palestinian migrants, son of a religious Muslim. His father built several mosques in the country. Well, that's already not the most standard story for El Salvador. And Nayib wasn't like everyone else. Here's his photo from the '99 graduation album, which he signed himself as school terrorist. Although actually the Bukeles are a very wealthy family. His father is a businessman who opened up the first McDonald's in El Salvador. Nayib went to a private school, dropped out of university, worked in a nightclub and a Yamaha store, then went into political PR and decided to become a politician himself. In his very first election, he beat his opponents by 200 votes and becomes the youngest mayor in the country's history. There will be many more records ahead, but first, his reforms swept through the small town of Nuevo Cascatalan like a hurricane. The new mayor opened a 24-hour hospital and library, gave out free food to pensioners, and even gave away his salary for scholarships for school children in English and programming. He also ran social media accounts where he actively talked about his work. Just to remind you, this is 2012. Most politicians on social media look something like this. Which way should a tie go? Toward you or away from me? So the changes were striking. The young politician immediately attracted attention, and after his first term, they promoted him. The party nominated Bukele for mayor of the capital city of San Salvador. In Latin America, the capital's mayor is usually the second most important person in the state. Those were the big hopes placed on Bukele, who had entered politics just 3 years earlier. And he won again, and again took on big projects, but now on the scale of the capital. Renovations, construction, shopping centers, restaurants, even his first mega project, lighting at every intersection. In general, how much better San Salvador became under Bukele. And again, he actively ran social media, Twitter, Facebook streams. The mayor didn't give press conferences because he answered all questions himself online. All this was part of his brand. Glasses, ball cap, leather jacket, photos in his office with his feet on the desk, rallies that looked like concerts, board games, memes, Fortnite. Instead of party symbols, he used his own logo, a blue letter N. This meant new ideas. While it also happened to be the first letter of his name. In general, Bukele became a rock star. 20% of the country's population followed him on social media. That's more than the president had. So it was obvious where he was aiming. Very soon, in another stream, Bukele announced he was running for president. The third election of his life. He promised to fight corruption. His slogan, "There's enough money if you don't steal." Of course, he ran the entire campaign on social media too, and didn't even travel around the country. But that was enough to win for the third time. Soon, Bukele was taking selfies from the UN General Assembly podium and said that more people would see this selfie on Instagram than the General Assembly itself. He looked like a president from the future. Times had changed. Now politicians behave like this. So everyone in El Salvador was really waiting for changes. The new president promised to build them a modern country that would forget about the past. But El Salvador's past wasn't very pleasant, and it's important to know about this to understand everything. For half of the 20th century, El Salvador was ruled by a military junta, a pretty brutal regime. But by the 80s, people were tired of it. Socialist ideas became popular in the country, a pretty typical story for Latin America. You probably know about Cuba, but socialists also came to power in neighboring Nicaragua. In El Salvador, left-wing rebels decided to overthrow the government. A civil war began. The rebels were indirectly supported by other socialist countries, while the US strongly helped the regime because Ronald Reagan was a hardline anti-communist. Under no circumstances did he want another Cuba next door. Well, by the way, it somewhat resembles Argentina's story. I made a separate video about that. Watch it if you're interested. But in El Salvador, the civil war lasted for 12 years. 75,000 people died. Even more went missing. A quarter of the population fled to other countries. This was one of the most terrible episodes in El Salvador's history, but it ended along with the Cold War. The rebels and the junta signed a peace agreement. Each side created their own party and they continued fighting each other. But while these two parties battled for power, the country remained poor and destroyed. Corruption flourished there. There was a lot of crime. El Salvador was so poor that 16% of GDP consisted of money that immigrants sent back to their families. This was the kind of state that Nayib Bukele now governed. He promised to end all of this, but his plans didn't please the two old parties because he had taken power away from them. All they had left was parliament. They still controlled parliament and refused to allocate money for reforms. The happy fairy tale of the millennial president stumbled over the harsh reality of Central American politics. But at this moment, Nayib Bukele showed that he could do more than just write on Twitter. If necessary, he could take what was his by force. The president came to a parliament session with soldiers and completely pulled off a reform through which his supporters gained a majority there. An effective move, no doubt, only it looked like a power grab. Many condemned the president's actions, but for Bukele, there was no such thing as bad PR. It didn't matter to him that they said bad things about him. What mattered was that they were talking, so he played along. He started running social media in English and wrote in his profile header, "World's coolest dictator." 20 years ago, he trolled classmates. Now he trolls the whole world. For anyone else, this would be the end of their career. But Bukele turned everything into a PR move. He wanted to attract investors' attention because he had already come up with his loudest project. The president began building a crypto state in El Salvador. ATMs appeared where you could buy Bitcoin. Part of the state reserves were converted to crypto. Plans appeared for Bitcoin beach resorts in Bitcoin City. In El Salvador, they even started mining cryptocurrency using volcanic energy. On one hand, this was an economic issue. El Salvador was a very poor country. They didn't even have their own currency. They used the US dollar. But of course, it wasn't just about that. At that moment, Bitcoin was making noise around the world. And naturally, everyone started talking about El Salvador. Crypto companies began opening offices there. They gave residency permits for Bitcoin investments. And the face of this entire project was Nayib Bukele. El Salvador officially recognized Bitcoin as legal tender. In just a few years, he went from an unknown mayor of a small town to a news hero around the world. But these plans were far from popular with everyone. In March 2022, the entire image of the Bitcoin state collapsed. That weekend, 87 people were killed in El Salvador. They all had become victims of local gangs. And this was a signal. Gangs are actually El Salvador's main problem overall. Remember I said that during the war, a quarter of the population fled the country? Well, almost all of them ended up in California, in poor areas of Los Angeles. There in the 80s were their own street gangs, the legendary Crips and Bloods. For poor migrants, this lifestyle became the only way to protect themselves and earn money. So refugees from El Salvador founded their own groups. And when in the 90s the US decided to fight crime, all these migrants were deported back to their homeland. They returned to El Salvador, a poor post-war country where 6 million people live, where former soldiers can't find work, where tons of weapons were made, and where an entire generation grew up in the midst of combat. That is, violence was considered something normal. Sounds like ideal conditions for crime. And within just a few years, 2 street gangs controlled the entire country. They took protection money, kidnapped people for ransom, recruited children. Literally anyone could be shot on the street for looking the wrong way, and no one would ever look for the perpetrators. These gangs were fine with a poor, corrupt country where politicians do nothing and fight each other instead of fighting crime. But Nayib Bukele didn't suit them very well. That weekend in March of 2022, One of the victims was a very simple surf instructor. His body was found tied up on the road that led to Bitcoin Beach. This wasn't even a hint, it was a statement. The street gangs made it clear that the state of the future didn't suit them. Bukele's entire grandiose project was under threat. He faced the strongest opponent imaginable in El Salvador. Only it seems they didn't know who they declared war on. The president launched a plan in El Salvador called Iron Fist. What did it consist of? A state of emergency was declared in the country. People were forbidden to gather in groups, and police and army began massive raids. They burst into homes and took everyone who seemed suspicious to them, even children, because they could also be gang members. People were arrested at home, on the streets, at work, 1,000 every day. Everyone who seemed to look like gangsters. In the end, 80,000 people ended up behind bars. That's 1% of El Salvador's population. You can calculate yourself how much that would be in your country. Moreover, keeping such criminals in regular prisons was impossible. So the next step was to open a special mega prison, a terrorist detention center known for its harsh conditions. 100 people can be held in one cell here. They sleep on metal beds, move only in groups, in handcuffs, squatting. Any violation threatens solitary confinement. This is an absolutely dark room where you can't even see your own hands. In this prison, there are no letters, no packages, no visits. Escaping from there was simply impossible. And most importantly, none of these people hope to be released. Oh yes, and don't forget about the PR. This prison was advertised as a large-scale state project. Why look far? Even I made a video about them in New Reels. Everything looked so shocking and many people made videos because very soon, Nayib Bukele became the most popular world leader on TikTok. His ratings soared. In the next elections, Bukele got 84%, and his party, which recently simply didn't exist, took almost all the seats in parliament. This was an absolute victory. Bukele became the most popular person in Latin America. His rating is higher than the Pope's. He made his second inauguration a world event. Dozens of famous politicians came there. It was a real show. Bukele came up with new costumes for himself and for soldiers. Guests were taken to restaurants, to Google's office, and right at night they were led into the city to show how safe everything had become. Now, Bukele is an example for the entire region. Several countries already say they want to do the same as him. Ecuador's president declared its own war on gangs. Ministers from Argentina go to El Salvador for internships. Honduras began building 2 mega prisons. Costa Rica, Guatemala. For all these countries, Bukele is an example of how you can defeat competitors, defeat crime, attract money, and become a superstar at the same time. And not just Guatemala. Tucker Carlson directly asks, why can't the US do the same thing? Bukele is friends with Elon Musk, and Donald Trump recently agreed to send migrants to El Salvador, whom US authorities consider criminals. They call it a prison. The president of a poor country with a population of 6 million people became an important figure on the world stage, Trump's key ally in the region, and an example for other states. All of this thanks to the harshest crackdown on crime imaginable. But there are things that are usually not told in the story, because every medal has 2 sides. Of course, you can say that such an approach worked. The number of murders in El Salvador dropped rapidly, as did crime in general. The country is now safer than Canada. Fewer and fewer residents are leaving. On streets where you couldn't walk in the dark before, new businesses have opened. People walk in parks. Every year, more and more tourists come to El Salvador. The country appears in various rankings as the best travel destination. A state where there was once only war, corruption, and crime has now become the capital of coffee, surfing, and volcanoes. But everyone forgets several important details. The state of emergency, which was introduced for a month, was extended 28 times. It's still in effect. Several hundred people in the mega prisons died from harsh conditions. None of them had a real trial. And among tens of thousands of prisoners, there are surely innocent people. Now in El Salvador, more people are behind bars than in any country in the world, if you count in percentages. But the crime rate was falling even before Bukele became president. And besides, journalists found out that all these incredible figures might be understated. For example, murder statistics stopped counting cases when criminals buried a body. And surprisingly, exactly these types of crimes became more common. Rumors say that at the beginning of his term, Bukele cooperated with gangs and allegedly even made concessions just to lower this formal rating to get beautiful numbers. Maybe that's exactly why now El Salvador's president is asking the US to extradite gang leaders who might know something about this page in his biography. and the prosecutor who was leading the investigation was fired. And the gangs themselves in El Salvador are very different from other countries. These aren't some mighty cartels with their own army. These are street criminals who made money through extortion. Defeating them is much easier than fighting criminal networks in Mexico or somewhere like Ecuador. But most importantly, a brutal war on crime doesn't yet mean a happy future. El Salvador's economy isn't meeting expectations. The Bitcoin state idea failed. No one ever started using cryptocurrency. Investors left. Money became less and less. El Salvador had to ask for help from the International Monetary Fund, but they set conditions and had to abandon Bitcoin. In general, Bukele's loud projects often bring more problems. Even the city of Nuevo Cascatalan, where his career began, was left in deep debt after him. Finally, over several years, Bukele concentrated all power in his hands. Parliament, courts, army, everything works for him. According to the Constitution, you can't be president in El Salvador for more than one term. But Bukele changed the judges in time, and now he's already in his second term and thinking about a third. This whole story isn't just about El Salvador. Bukele is a new generation politician. His entire image, social media, cryptocurrency, he runs the country like a business. He doesn't pay attention to criticism, responds to it with decisive actions. Such politicians are gaining popularity, especially in countries where authorities haven't been able to deal with certain problems for a long time. And surely there will be more such politicians in the future. But if you don't like a company's management, you can quit. But how do you quit a country? So it turns out that when it comes to the world's coolest dictator, for some what matters is that he's the coolest, and for others what matters is that he's a dictator.